What's going on, everyone? Thanks for joining me. So today we're going to go through something pretty interesting. It is the off season as far as American racing goes. We do have some pretty cool off season races coming up, and we have the World Supercross Series coming, which we will also be covering. But right now, what I want to do is go through a speculative lineup on which riders will be going to which coast in the 2025 Supercross season. Obviously, this is far from a locked-in lineup, as things could definitely change with injuries and as the season gets closer, but we are already hearing some rumors circling as far as which riders are heading to which coast. But generally speaking, the teams and the riders are pretty secretive about which coast they're going to race on, and it does get a little bit frustrating, at least as a fan or someone who's trying to watch the sport. You a lot of times don't even know exactly who you're going to get. If you're buying your tickets for, say, Anaheim 1 a few weeks in advance, you really don't even know who's going to be there as far as in the 250 class. Personally, I do feel like it is a pretty big deal which coast the riders end up selecting, or the teams, or whatever you want to call it. One really good example that comes to mind to help illustrate that is if you look back at the 2008 Supercross season, and you have on the West Coast the Ryan Dungey and Jason Lawrence battle, and then on the East Coast you have the Trey Canard versus Ryan Villopoto battle. And if Trey Canard does not suffer that off-season injury leading into Supercross, he likely ends up racing the West Coast division. So we would have had a Dungey versus Canard versus Lawrence battle. And can you imagine how much different that would have looked compared to Jason Lawrence ending up getting in Dungey's head and taking home the championship? And then not only that, but the East Coast championship would have also looked a lot different, because Ryan Villopoto would have ended up completely dominating that series. So all of that's just to say that one rider changing coasts, or depending on which coast they pick, could completely change the landscape of a championship. So now that we got all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start speculating as far as which riders are going to go to which coast. I'm going to go through team by team and just kind of tell you guys what my thoughts are. So let's go ahead and start off with the largest team and the least clear team and get that out of the way with Star Yamaha. So I would speculate that Star is going to go ahead and send Hayden Deegan on the West Coast this year. Obviously, we know Hayden is heading up towards the 450 class sooner rather than later, and I think they would like him to get some experience on the West Coast Supercross tracks. So I expect to see that this year, unless there is some sort of setback with his surgery or anything like that. As far as the other 5 riders that we believe will be on the team this season, I pretty much expect them all to stay on the same coast that they raced last year. So that would mean you would have Thrasher and Brown on the West Coast with Deegan, and then on the East Coast you would look to see Max Anstey, Michael Moseman, and Daxton Bennick. I think Michael Moseman will probably have to race the East Coast because he's got a lot going on as far as his injury history, and he's really going to struggle to get back going, so he's going to need the East Coast regardless. I think we'll see Pierce Brown on the West Coast because we did just see him win the final round of the SMX series, and he's typically been a West Coast rider, so he's used to that type of dirt and setting, and I think that Star Yamaha really does have some high hopes with him, so I don't look for them to do anything crazy with him. I think they're just going to keep him where they know things are going to work. He's already got momentum, so why not get him back out there sooner than later? The only reason I would see him going over to the East Coast is if he's having a hard time gelling with that bike for some reason. Obviously, he's been a KTM Gas rider his whole career, so maybe he has a hard time switching to the Japanese bikes. If that's the case, I could see him going to the East Coast. Otherwise, I look for him to be on the West Coast. Then as far as Thrasher being on the West Coast, I saw him there last year. I think they are okay with what they saw. He got them a race win, so why not just leave him there and see what you could get out of him. Then with Anstey, we saw him actually be a championship contender on the East Coast last year on that Firepower Honda. I do think they're looking at Max Anstey as a title contender. I'm not sure that they're really considering anyone else on the team as a title contender. So with Hayden Deegan anchoring the West Coast, I think they're going to consider Max Anstey their East Coast anchor. Then with Daxton Bennick returning in his second season for the team, he never really lit it up last season, so I do look for them to try to make things as easy on him as possible. Let's keep him on the same coast that he raced last year, give him as much time as possible to develop in Supercross in the off season, and let's send him east. So that's my thoughts for the Star Racing Yamaha team. Let's move on to another big team in the Monster Energy Kawasaki Pro Circuit team. So these guys also have 5 or 6 riders that we know of right now. It is a little bit hard to say exactly where they're going to have everybody line up, but I do think it's pretty likely that we can make an educated guess here. So I think we're going to see a lot of the same coast that we saw with these guys last year. So what I'm expecting to see is Levi Kitchen and Garrett Marchbanks lining up on the West Coast, and then Cameron McAdoo and Seth Hamaker lining up on the East Coast. And the two riders that would be kind of up in the air is Ty Masterpool and maybe Drew Adams if we see a pro debut in Supercross. So jumping back to the first four riders we just talked about, the reasoning behind that is because Seth Hamaker and Cameron McAdoo are both coming off of injuries. We did see Cameron McAdoo get back to racing in SMX, so he's definitely in a reasonable position and he could definitely go west. But we already saw McAdoo race the East Coast last year, and he did fairly well over there. And then Hamaker, it's a little less clear exactly what's going on with him, and I do expect him to potentially go east this year because of his injuries. He was supposed to come back from motocross, and then he had another setback. So definitely enough time to heal during the off season, but I would not be surprised to see him go to the East Coast. So those are two of their four solidified and established riders on the team, leaving the other two in Levi Kitchen and Garrett Marchbanks to go west. Now Levi was already a West Coast Championship contender last year, and Garrett Marchbanks also did very well on the Club MX team last year. He did eventually end up crashing out and not finishing the season, but we did see him do well on the West Coast as well. So it would make sense to send Kitchen and Marchbanks on the West Coast anyway. And then I think you have to see Ty Masterpool joining them on the West Coast. And the reason I say that is because if they are potentially looking at sending Drew Adams to go pro, they're probably going to want to try to race some futures races with him first. And therefore, he's going to have to start out on futures in the West Coast series. And then maybe he goes pro for the East Coast series. So just to run it back fully, you'd see West Coast, Kitchen, Marchbanks, Masterpool, and then East Coast, you'd have McAdoo, Hamaker, Adams, and that's if Adams does go pro. Moving on to Team Triumph, another pretty exciting team. They did expand their roster this year, so they're probably going to have a 2-rider per coast team. So definitely something cool to see. They basically only had one rider in Supercross on either series, like just one total. They didn't even race the West Coast. I would not be surprised at all to see them get a win this season with some of their riders, and I would be absolutely shocked if they can't bring home a podium. So as far as their team lineup, we pretty much know that it's going to be Jalek Swoll, Jordan Smith, Austin Faulkner, and Styles Robertson. And I think that as far as which riders are going to go to which coast, it's fairly obvious. I do think we're going to see Jalek Swoll and Jordan Smith go on the West Coast, and then we're going to probably have Austin Faulkner and Styles Robertson going east. The reason I think that is because we have Austin Faulkner, who is a clear established race winner and true anchor rider. And then you also have Jordan Smith, who is definitely a championship contender. We saw that last year. And then Jalek Swoll, who has been extremely consistent and got Triumph their first podium this season in motocross. Then you have the wild card of Styles Robertson, who we didn't see at all last year, and we're really not sure what to expect out of him. So I think that Swoll and Smith are going to go west because Swoll's already been on the bike. He's ready to go. He knows what to expect. He already did a full season of Supercross with the team last year. So let's send him west. He's ready to go. Jordan Smith was already on the West Coast last year. He was a championship contender. He's healthy. He's ready to go. He's been on the team the longest as far as these guys, the 3 new riders. Obviously, probably they all basically joined at the same time, technically speaking, as far as they had to wait for their contracts to expire. But we've known Jordan Smith has been going to Triumph for a very long time. So I look for him to come out firing. He's probably going to be ready to go. Those 2 guys are probably going to go west, leaving Austin Faulkner and Styles Robertson to go east. Both of those guys are coming off of major injuries. So definitely makes sense for them to take some more time, gel with the bike, get everything going, and go east. Moving on to some of the smaller team rosters, things get a lot more clear. So looking at Team Honda, pretty much have to expect Joe Shimoda to race the West Coast and Chance Hymas to maybe race the East Coast, if he can even do that. We saw Chance have to go in to get his ACL repaired at the end of motocross. Really unfortunate. Definitely something I was concerned about all season, and I did voice my opinion on the fact that I thought he should just go in and get it repaired now, so that way he could at least return healthy for the 2025 season. And it does seem that that right now is even in jeopardy. Hopefully we can see Chance return to Supercross. He didn't look great in Supercross last season, but he definitely killed it in motocross. So that was really cool to see. But either way, look for Joe Shimoda to be on the West Coast and Chance Hymas to be on the East Coast if he races Supercross at all. Moving down to KTM, definitely expect the riders to stay on the same coast that they were last year. And that's for one simple reason, and that is that Tom Vial ended up winning the championship. So look for him to defend his championship. They're definitely going to want that #1 plate out there. So Tom Vial is going to have to go race the East Coast. Julian Beaumer is going to end up back on the West Coast. Pretty straightforward. Moving down to Husqvarna, same thing could be said. RJ Hampshire is definitely going to want to defend his title. He's going to be rocking that #1 plate, so he's going to be on the West Coast, and that's going to leave Casey Cochran going east. Another really good reason for RJ to race the West Coast is because we pretty much know that RJ is going to be moving up to the 450, and it sounds like he's probably going to be racing majority of the East Coast rounds on a 450. So that's going to be really cool to see. And obviously it would not make sense for RJ to race the off rounds of the West Coast series on the 450, because that means he's going to start out on a 450. That would be kind of weird. And he wouldn't even be defending his title. So definitely going to see RJ go west unless something crazy happens and he gets seriously injured. Then as far as the only gas rider, we have Ryder DeFrancisco. So with Ryder, he's basically a teammate with Casey Cochran and RJ Hampshire. He will be on a gas, but he's basically going to be a third Husqvarna rider. So if you oversimplify how you're looking at this a little bit, it's kind of like they're going to have 2 riders per coast, with RJ Hampshire and Ryder DeFrancisco on the west, and then RJ Hampshire and Casey Cochran on the east, with RJ being a 450 rider on the East Coast rounds. Then obviously we're going to have Malcolm on the 450, but that's not what I'm talking about at the moment. We're just going through the 250 teams. Now there is still one more team I want to go ahead and talk about real quickly, and there is other teams as well, but their picture is a lot less clear right now. So the last team we're going to talk about is going to be the Club MX team. As of right now, they have a 4-man roster, and that roster is going to be Cody Schock, Jet Reynolds, Max Voland, and Mark Phineas. So looking at that roster, arguably you have 2 established riders and 2 guys that you're kind of developing. I would argue that Cody Schock and Max Voland are more established riders that you know you can trust to do well in Supercross. And then Jet Reynolds and Mark Phineas, you really just don't know what you're going to get. We've never really seen Jet Reynolds race Supercross. We saw him try last season and he ended up crashing in press day of round #1. So we never really got to see Jet race last year. And then Mark Phineas, completely unknown exactly what he's going to do. You'd have to expect him to struggle a little bit. So with those 4 riders, you'd have to imagine if they are going to try to race both coasts, which they have in the past, you're probably going to want to send Cody Schock on one coast and Max Voland on the other. So this part's really up in the air. It's really going to hinge on Max Voland. We saw him go down pretty rough last year. He ended up breaking his hip, but what really held him back was he actually suffered a back injury, and that thing really flared up, and he almost seems like he might be in an Adam Cianciarulo type situation where he's got this nerve damage type of thing, but in his back, and it's really not sure exactly how he's going to fare moving forward. He really couldn't ride much at all this whole year, so really hate to see that. He is back on the bike, so hopefully he can just keep developing, keep moving forward, start to gel with that Yamaha, and if things are really starting to accelerate and look good moving forward, I could see them sending him west. We saw him racing the West Coast last year, and that was looking pretty good up until he couldn't race anymore due to his injury. And then Cody Schock did race the East Coast last year, where he did extremely well. So in a way, it would make sense for that to happen that way, where we see Max Voland go west and Cody Schock go to the East Coast. But in reality, I would not be surprised at all to actually have the opposite happen, where we have Cody Schock, who is healthy, is on a 3-year deal with the team, end up going west, and Max Voland, the new guy who is coming off of a major injury, going to the East Coast. One other thing we do have to consider, though, is that Max Voland has been living in Southern California recently, and it doesn't really look like he's moving to be with the rest of the Club MX team. So if he does end up staying out west in Southern California, he really could be a good fit for the West Coast series. So it really is hard to say for sure exactly what's going to happen. If I had to pick one way or another, I would say that we're going to see Max Vohland line up for round number 1 alongside of Jet Reynolds. And then you will see Cody Schock and Mark Phineas line up on the East Coast. If Max can get comfortable on the Yamaha and really come out swinging, he could be off to a really good start. We saw him do exactly that last season on the Kawasaki, and he could be the guy to really help jumpstart that program and develop that 2025 bike for the rest of the team, especially for Cody Schock and Mark Phineas, who would be awaiting their start on the East Coast. If Max does line up for the West Coast, I really think you will definitely see Cody Schock going east, because I don't think they're going to want both of their guys that they know are going to get results on the same coast. I think they're going to want somebody solid on either side of the series. So just to quickly recap all the way from the top, I'm predicting on the West Coast, you're going to have Hayden Deegan, Nate Thrasher, Pierce Brown, Joe Shimoda, Julian Beaumer, RJ Hampshire, Ryder DeFrancisco, Levi Kitchen, Garrett Marchbanks, Ty Masterpool, Jalik Swoll, Jordan Smith, Maximus Vohland, and Jet Reynolds. And then moving over to the East Coast, I'm thinking you're going to see Max Anstey, Michael Moseman, Daxton Bennick, Chance Hymas, Tom Vial, Casey Cochran, Cameron McAdoo, Seth Hamaker, possibly Drew Adams, Austin Faulkner, Styles Robertson, Cody Schock, Mark Phineas, and if Cole Davies ends up making a pro supercross debut, he would also be on the East Coast. I'm curious what you guys think. Let me know which side you think would be more stacked if this was the lineup. Personally, I think the West Coast is looking pretty stacked, especially if this is really who ends up showing up for it. I would be pretty excited to see Deegan go up against RJ Hampshire, Levi Kitchen, and Joe Shimoda. But then on the East Coast, you would also have a pretty good battle. You would have Tom Vial, Cameron McAdoo, Austin Faulkner, maybe Chance Hymas, Max Anstey. So definitely nothing to sleep on. Once the season starts and we know for sure exactly who's lining up for which coast, I'm gonna jump back in here and see exactly how accurate I was. So I'm also curious to see how that works out. That's gonna go and do it for this video. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in the next video.